Okay, I'll make a couple announcements as we get going. We've got handouts on the back table there. I brought a few extra handouts of the biblical timeline in line with what was happening historically with the major empires in that part of the world at the time. If you picked one of those up and already have one, share it with people who don't. I'll bring more copies of that next time. I think I only brought 5 or 6 of those. And it shows a timeline. You've got an extra one, Kate? You've got an extra one? Who hasn't received one of these before? A little timeline? You guys haven't received one before. You're new. Here you go. Okay. All right, so today we're in the part of the story of God that's in the middle of the covenantal period. What are the 5 C's of God's story? Creation, covenant, Christ, church, consummation. Okay. Are we or are we not still in God's story? We are, yes. We're still part of God's story right now. Nothing that takes place is void of the hand of the story of God. That's the beauty of it. And it's tempting to read the Bible as if it's a historical book and has nothing revealed for us for today. While there's a lot of historicity, there's a lot of historical stuff that takes place, and it takes place during a context. A lot of this Bible study is designed to pull out and have God's big time story revealed to us. And so we're flying at 30,000 feet looking at this and saying, these are the main movements in God's story. God made everything. God built covenants with human beings. God sent His Son, Jesus Christ. God created His church. That's where we are today. And then God created the holy completion. He wrapped everything up perfectly. That's to come. That's the next thing we're waiting on. And so today we are in the covenantal period. In the third part of the covenantal period, we're spending 7 different Wednesdays on the covenantal period because, well, why do you think that is? Biblically, that's pretty much the whole Old Testament, which is the largest portion of the Bible, the Old Testament. So in the covenantal period, you have the covenants made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, right? And then through their ministry, they end up in Egypt. They have to leave Egypt. Exodus is called the Great Exit. Then you have the Promised Land is inherited. That's where we are today. That's primarily Joshua and Judges. Those 2 books cover that. After the Promised Land, you have a united kingdom. Who's the famous king? There were 3 kings during the United Kingdom. There were Saul, David, and Solomon. David's usually he's the prominent king, the one that, Jesus bears his name. The son of David, what they call out. Interestingly, you've got, during the period of King David, we're going to get more into that next week. What's revealed through God is a threefold system of checks and balances that comes out during this period, and that the people of God during the United Kingdom are always left with at least these three roles filled. There's always a king, a priest, and a prophet. And you'll see these groups held in tension to each other. The king's job is to take care of the kingdom, to send out the army, to all the things King David did. King David was the king. There's also a priest. And if you remember, the priest's job was to represent who before who? They were to represent the people before God. You're right, okay. And then the prophet's job was to do what? To represent who before who? To represent God before people, okay? And so these three actually were held in tension with each other. And one great example of these being held in tension were, there was King David. What was his biggest public shame and mistake? Bathsheba. He had an affair with Bathsheba. He arranged the death of her husband. The priest, his role wasn't he wasn't in charge of keeping the king in check. Okay? But who came and confronted King David? The prophet. The prophet came and represented God before a human. And if you think about how powerful that was, Nathan had the courage to go before the king. And the king had just, I mean, this is the king. He's the most popular person in the land. He's the most powerful person in the land. He had covered up a great sin. And Nathan went before the king to call him out on it. Well, in a lot of cultures, Nathan's life would have been at risk doing that, right? David could have easily killed Nathan to cover it all up, because he's not afraid to kill anybody, is he? He'd already done that. He started off by killing Goliath. He's not afraid of slaying people. But the prophet Nathan went before the king, and when the prophet Nathan spoke to David and shamed him, did David kill Nathan? What did he do? He repented. He recognized the role of the prophet. And before the prophet, it's kind of like paper, rock, scissors, right? The king can't defeat the prophet can't defeat the priest. You kind of go through that whole thing. So they're all held in. It's an interesting form of checks and balances. Kind of like we have the executive, the judicial, and then the legislative. It's pretty neat how that worked out. What's that? David confessed before the prophet. Yeah. So that really evolves during this United Kingdom. This is a glorious time in the covenantal period. This is where most of the Jewish people point back to as wanting to restore. And we're going to get to that next week. So Promised Land, United Kingdom. What happens after the United Kingdom? Yeah, so divided kingdom. You had the north and the south. Then you had the, what's that? Then you had the fall / captivity. What's the seventh? Return and restore. Okay. Now that takes us, is there an E at the end of restore? Come on, Don. Thank you. I'm an engineer, remember that. And I got my degree from another school, so we weren't into spelling. Spelling and the fine arts aren't taught at A&M. So those are the 6 movements of the covenantal period. The covenants are made. The covenants, the people are brought out of Egypt. The people, actually we skipped the Exodus includes wandering in the desert. The people inherit the land, which is today. The kingdom is united. The kingdom is divided. The kingdom falls. The kingdom's restored. And then 300 or so years after that, 300 plus years after that, more about 450, that's when Jesus comes. And so we're actually going to spend an entire lesson dealing with that 450-year gap, which is actually in the scriptures in the Catholic Church called the Apocrypha. That's on your schedule. So that's going to be in a few weeks. We'll hit that. We are in week 6 of 14. We're almost halfway through the entire Bible. Can you believe that? On a survey course. I'm not making you read the whole thing. Okay, so where we are today is the Jewish people have wandered in the desert for 40 years. If you remember during that time, like any organization or community that goes through a hard time, and we call it a time in the desert, that's some of the most identity-forming time. It forms a resilience among the people. It forms a lot of their stories and not folklore, but these deep stories that they would tell around the campfires to restore the great deeds of God. This is where the celebration of the Passover becomes more than just an event, but actually a religious rite. It was during the desert that Moses, is chosen by God to reveal the 10 Commandments and all of the Torah, which are, I forget if it's 613 or 618 Jewish laws. It's an extensive law book. And so all these things take place in the desert. Moses dies, and he hands the baton over to his successor. His name is Joshua. There's a whole book of the Bible written about Joshua, or what God did through Joshua. And the story picks up with them on the other side of the Jordan. So in the Holy Land, when you're telling the story to somebody, remember one of the goals of this class is that when someone comes up to you and says, "You're a Christian, you believe in the Bible?" Well, yes. What does the Bible say? So you can tell them the story, okay? If they want to get into a political argument, good luck. But, so I like to draw the Holy Land. In Jesus' time, this is called the Sea of Galilee. This is the Dead Sea. This is the big ocean. Jerusalem's right here. And so Joshua and all of the Jews are on this side of the river, okay, waiting to cross over. And that's where the story picks up. That's where Joshua talks to the people, and at the very beginning, he's cheering them on. He's giving them a pep talk. He reminds them of where they came from. Now, we're just about to go into Disney World. Don't forget where you came from, okay? We're just about to go into the land of milk and honey. Act like you've been here before, okay? Don't be crazy. Don't be wild. Don't let the security bring you back to me, like you do with the youth group. So he's giving them this big talk. They come across the waters, and there's some interesting echoes in the beginning of Joshua. If you notice, they use the Ark of the Covenant to stand in the waters with the priests. What happens to the River Jordan? It stops. And so they cross on dry land, just like when they crossed the Red Sea or the Sea of the Reeds, whatever the History Channel just told you most recently. But when they crossed the sea to leave to Egypt, when they come over, they begin a series, and this is just to sum it up, they begin a series of military moves to completely wipe out the Holy Land. Now, my job is to teach you the content of the Bible. A lot of people struggle at this point in the story because of genocide, mass murders. They are instructed to literally take out every living creature in these villages. Okay? It's very harsh, including children, including animals. It doesn't make sense. And it just doesn't sound like our God. And so a lot of people struggle theologically in this time. I commend you to struggle with this. Struggle with it. It's also in the story. I can't tell you, I'm not sure. This is one of my own struggles, why God would do this. There are things going on in the world right now. We read this as part of our heritage, part of our story, and we cheer it on. And so one person's story of freedom fighting and receiving something granted to them is somebody else's story of terrorism. You see that? We don't have time to get into that today. So I'm just going to tell you the story, and you can stare at your ceiling fan at night and ask the Lord all these questions of your heart. How about that? Fair? Okay. So, Joshua engages in these military campaigns. If you were to follow them and using a map, he comes in, and he's with God. God's helping him. And so like the Battle of Jericho, for instance, remember they marched around. How many times did they march around? How many days? 7. And 7 biblically, what does the number 7 mean? Complete, right. So on a perfectly whole, complete sense, they march around it, they blow the trumpets, and then they yell. Remember what's creepy is they don't make a sound the first 6 days. They've got all these people. The people in the Holy Land, this is what's interesting. Before they get there, they've already heard the reputation of the Hebrews, of what the Lord did for them in the Holy Land. In the desert, how he wiped out all these threats to them, how he saved them from these imminent issues, how nobody could stand against them and their God. So, the Aggies are about to host Ole Miss, and I'm scared. I really am. They just beat Alabama. And so, these people have a reputation. Like, OU's coming to town, y'all. Baylor's getting here, y'all. Look out. You can cheer all you want, but, be prepared to wear a failed smile, right? And so the people in the Holy Land are just they don't call it the Holy Land, they call it their land, are just scared to death of these groups, of this group of tribes, which have become united as the Hebrews, 12 different tribes. And they come across dry land, which is terrifying in and of itself, and they come to Jericho and they march around Jericho. They march around Jericho and they don't make a sound. They just let it build. On the 7th day, they blow the trumpets and they yell as loud as they could yell, and the walls come tumbling down. And then, according to the scriptures, they were instructed to go and slaughter every single living creature in that town. And then, so they have these styles of military campaigns. They slip up every once in a while. People hoard. They don't obey God to the letter of the law. They might let somebody live. They might hoard hoarding of possessions happens in this time. And the next time they go out and they battle, the Lord lets the other guys win, the Amorites, or whoever they were fighting at the time, defeat the Hebrews. And so there's this constant sway between the Jews having to completely follow the letter of the law of what it means to be a victor in these types of battles for God to bless them on the next battle. But you can follow it, and you may have a map in the back of your Bible. I don't have it memorized, but they come this direction, and then they come up this direction, and then they end up just going around. And I'm not a military guy, but they go and they just travel around and clear the land, like you would clear a building or clear a room, and they drive out almost all of the people they're called to drive out. But when the book of Judges, which is the second book we're looking at today, when it starts up, it mentions that the Jewish people they weren't faithful. Maybe it was compassion, maybe it was fear, but they didn't drive out all the people they were called to drive out when they had all that momentum. You know how important momentum is, right? They didn't capitalize on that momentum. And Judges chapter 2 mentions all of the people. It says Israel's disobedience. It says, I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you from the land that you're going, that I promised you. I said I will never break my covenant with you. But you made a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You were nice to them. You did not obey my commandments. You did not tear down the other gods' altars in the land. Now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And so at the end of this campaign, because of some of the unfaithfulness of the Jewish people to ruthlessly execute this conquering of the land, over time they end up being punished by it. And so in chapter 3, at the very beginning, the first six verses of chapter 3 in Judges names all of the remaining kingdoms. And if you notice in the story of the Jewish people from here on out in the Bible, or at least through the kingdom periods, these are the same types of people that continue to be thorns in the sides of the Jews. Goliath was a Philistine. 5 kings and tribes of the Philistines remain. I don't remember I'm not an anthropologist, but one of the deals about the Philistines I thought was very fascinating was the Jewish people were still living under when you transition from like an Iron Age into a Bronze Age, or I don't remember the order. When you transition into different ages, there's some gray area in there, where one of the nations around may be at the front edge, like the United States militarily, while there's other nations that haven't quite caught on. They don't have the resources, and so what we see at this point during these battles, like with Goliath, is that the Philistines are actually extremely equipped, state of the art. And again, I don't have it was either bronze or iron. Whichever one's ahead, the Philistines were living in that era. The Jews were living in the past. And so, because they failed to carry out their mission and drive out the Philistines, when they had all that momentum, when the fear of God was put in the land, they were constantly having to battle people that were just superior in weaponry and fighting tactics. So by the time they come and they fight Goliath, I think it's a true story, but I also think it's a symbolic story. You know, y'all seen the beginning of the movie Troy? Where they gather, go rewatch it, go to YouTube and say first battle scene in Troy, type it in there. The way that battle was fought was to mimic, or not to mock, but to show the way that the early fighting was done in those times. You would meet in a perfect killing ground, a historic ancient killing ground where every battle took place. And you would meet there with your armies, and in the story, they pitted up Brad Pitt, right? They pit up Apollo, what's his name? Achilles against Barabbas or Oagrius or some big mean guy. And it's the same story between King David when he was a shepherd and Goliath, and that was a symbolic story of having a shepherd boy go against a powerful, mighty warrior, to show the difference between the Jewish armies and the Philistine armies. And so when that story was first shared and told, it happened, but the symbolism behind it was just as important, just as powerful. So they come into the Holy Land, they settle it, and as we discussed last week, there are 12 different tribes, and y'all nailed it. Who was the tribe that doesn't get their own land? The Levites don't get their own land. So you've got the 11 tribes, and they're scattered all around the Holy Land after they wipe it out somewhat. So they've cleared it fairly